This morning we're taking a look at Chapter 8, User Controls, and user controls are another helpful little thing that we can utilize to kind of help build reusable components for our web pages. And I don't know if you guys are catching on to this theme with ASP.NET. There's a lot of emphasis on reusability of code and structure to really help accelerate development. In earlier chapters we worked with what they call server controls. And here we're working with what we call user controls. Server controls are objects that are pre-created and built into the interface. Some of them are simple HTML form elements, and some of them are a little bit more complicated structures, like those weird panel things that you were working with. In this case, the user controls that we're looking at in this chapter, they're going to have you create banner ads, real primitive ones that programmatically change and are reusable and insertable into any page you want. And there's a little bit of a difference in using a user control and a server control in that the fact that you're creating it, for one thing, but in the way it's implemented. Also in the fact that when you create a user control, you're really kind of creating a little mini web page, but you are not able to access that page as a page. It can only be used as a component, and you'll see that. All right, so when we start looking at user controls, okay, well, I got a highlight here. That's nice. As it says there, encapsulating markup controls and code that you need repeatedly throughout your site. So inside of a user control, you can put pretty much anything that you can put on a page. So in essence, it's really a little mini web page. The thing that kind of separates it from a server control is that you can also attach a code behind page and have it programmatically do something at the same time. There is a little bit of a change in that when you start utilizing a user control, even though it's like a mini page, it's got a different file extension. It's not ASPX anymore, it's ASCX. And once again, it cannot be directly accessed by a browser or a user typing in a URL. All right, so they're doing a little comparison here between a regular ASPX page and a user control, and it says they both have a markup section. So you can actually add regular HTML code and server controls, so you can put server controls inside your user controls. You can also use Visual Studio to design them just exactly the same way that you do pages. So you can jump into design view and all those things. You have that code behind file. And it also gives you access, it says here, to page-based information. So for example, if you're moving data back and forth, that user control has access to those data streams. It also has the ability to raise events, in other words, interact with the user interface very much like a standard page does. But there are some differences, and I think I probably already talked about a couple of them. So I noticed the file extension difference here, and that you can't request it directly in a browser. That's pretty important. The point of what they're going to have you do here is you're going to be creating this little banner ad. The images are already provided. And what they're going to do is they're going to create this control so that it holds an image, and then that image, depending on where it's placed on a page, where that user control is placed, so if we put it in the sidebar, it might appear vertically. And then we might put it in the body, and it'll switch dynamically to horizontal. So we're going to create something that's reusable, but also reacts programmatically. So it becomes not only something that we can reuse, but it's also got a little bit of dynamic content in and of itself.
So you can program it to be dynamic.
Yes.
Based on how you put it into a page, whether it's horizontal or vertical.
Right.
Not the user actually deciding.
That's correct. Right.
It's not something you can like drag and drop like it was, like we did like everything else.
Actually, you can drag and drop them.
Right into the code like we did before.
Yeah, I mean, once you've created the user control and it has become an entity, you can just pick it up and drop it onto a page. And it can go into a regular page, and it can go also into a master page.
You just have to make sure you have like the other thing that way it does it on both, like you did before.
I'm not sure what you're referring to exactly.
Is that like, when you have to check this box to put it into your other page also, to your design view also, instead of just in the deployment?
No, it doesn't, I don't, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I don't think that's the case. Okay. When you get to the point you actually start doing the work on this chapter and you start building it, you'll notice that they actually have an interface or a pre-built object template for it. It really is pretty much a blank object, but it does create pages, both the regular code page that we have our HTML and ASP code, and the code behind page with certain pre-built constructs. And I know that one thing that you'll notice when you first build the page is at that very top, that those ASP directives that they have. Notice here the part I have highlighted. We've seen like at page and at master, and now we're seeing the control. So it identifies it as a control, points also to the code behind file, etc. All right, so they have you walking through this, and notice that one of the conventions in ASP.NET is when you start creating controls is that you actually put them in their own folder. Just like you do a script or an image or anything else. Does it have to be in that folder? Well, technically no, but convention is really kind of an important thing here when you start moving through these like framework development approaches. And you stick with conventions basically because it allows you to work on projects and being able to move from project to project and understand where stuff's supposed to be. And then the more complicated pre-built templates that you start using, those things are just automatically put in those locations. And then regardless of the type of ASP.NET framework that you're going to be using, and as you guys move into doing stuff in an MVC format, those conventions become ever more critical because MVC really relies on those conventions in order to function. Where we're doing the standard ASP.NET stuff, you can kind of fudge it a little bit or do your own thing and it'll work just fine. So the general rule of thumb is when you're working with frameworks is don't mess with the conventions. Go with it, okay? Because if you do mess with them, you're going to find yourself spending a lot of time cleaning it up and getting it to work. All right, so there's a little walkthrough. And they give you an example here of what the banner is going to look like. That would be the vertical version. And the process for creating it is just like the process for creating a page. And because we're using master pages and because we're building these little pieces, we're not going to have all the other HTML overhead that comes with it. We're just building the piece we need, and that's it. Now, can you add this stuff to a master page or to a content page? Absolutely. There's really not too much functional difference between doing the two things. Notice, though, that we would add this other directive, and I suppose you should probably highlight that as well, called register. So in other words, when you're using a user control, you have to register the user control so the application knows that it can use it. All right, nothing too fancy here. It is just showing you some of the syntax that goes with it, and then walks you through the exercise of doing it. I don't know if you guys are in a habit of when you're reading this book that you work through the exercises and then actually read the content, or if you guys just do the exercises and skip everything else, and I understand if you do. But it's kind of good to understand what. I mean, I think it is pretty well written. My one little contention with the book, though, is when you're doing the step-by-step, don't skim the step-by-step. Read every word and read it really carefully. And I see you guys nodding, and I know that you know what I mean. Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating. Like we here in the SharePoint program are still using Visual Studio 2012, so that interface completely matches with the book. We were in the classroom last night, and the oldest version they had is 2013, and it's all different. Like they do a lot of like the CSS stuff, and probably some of those students are going to listen to this video, and they're going to see that that doesn't even appear in my menus. I can't find that anywhere. And then you got situations where it looks a little different, but you still find the stuff. So um, it's not a bad joke. It's just some things, grow and evolve, and they basically, the developers realize what stuff people do use and don't use, and then, if people aren't using a feature, why have it in the program?
I can see how each one of these works really good as like a partner project, and then going back and making them do the screenshots after and setting it up. Because then, like I was doing that with like the first instructor before that we had to have everyone sign, and like it made me have to review everything, even though like I already, did my class and stuff.
Yeah, and really, a little bit of repetition on the stuff isn't going to hurt you. Because it is different. It's different from the static HTML stuff, and it's different than PHP and JSP, those other technologies that we've looked at. Now, what I also find fascinating is if you are in the regular program at Gateway doing this stuff, people taking the ASP.NET class, if they stay in sequence, are taking it simultaneously with PHP. And in some ways, I think that's kind of cool because you can compare the two as you're learning them. But in another way, I almost kind of wish that PHP would come first so that people understand how a server-side language really executes. Because in terms of, the complexity of understanding, ASP.NET is a little bit more complicated to understand than PHP is. And really, that's one of the reasons why PHP is so popular, because you don't have to get very complicated with it. And it works pretty well. All right. My point here on this how it works section is after you do an exercise, I would behoove you to go through and read this. And usually if I'm working through the exercises in class, I'm kind of explaining exactly what's going on in this section kind of intuitively. But they don't really explain a lot as you're doing the steps, but in the aftermath, read that and you kind of hopefully bring it into focus a little bit more. All right, so when you are registering user controls, there's some ways to do it, and one way that you can do it is you can register it globally, and you can see you would put it in the web config file, and basically what that allows you to do is apply that user control to anything on the site. So you can just use it on any page, any master page, and not to confuse things, but you can actually put user controls inside of user controls. All right, because you remember you were asking, what about nesting master pages and how does that work? There's, what it comes down to basically is what you can conceptually handle. You could probably nest them indefinitely.
You were talking before about doing this banner and doing horizontally it works and set it up to use either way.
Yes.
Do you do that in PHP also, or do you have to build a separate?
Well, no, you could write the code to do that. I mean, that's just programming logic. Okay. So they're just using that as an example of that you can apply programmatic code to a user control and have it dynamically adjust based upon your code. But the truth is, any language that you would use, you can do that in JavaScript, you can do it in C#, you can, it doesn't matter. PHP would work just fine too. You just have to have the programming logic to go with it. Yeah, Visual Studio does allow you to ramp up a couple of tools a little bit more quickly than some of the other languages. But even PHP, the way that we learn PHP, PHP is like this embedded language that runs server-side, but in some ways behaves like JavaScript because it's in the document. But PHP can be manipulated to be an object-oriented programming language. It can be manipulated to do MVC. It can be manipulated to do all the user controls. You can do all those things with that language. It just doesn't have Visual Studio standing with it. Now, that doesn't mean there's not tools that allow you to do that with PHP. So, for example, if you were using Zen Studio, which is like the big professional PHP product, unfortunately it costs thousands of dollars, but that's what the real pros use when, if they're full-time PHP developers, and it has a lot of those tools there for you. But a lot of it is conceptual, So the fact that they have user controls and they're bound into the environment is really kind of a perk of working with Visual Studio. And it's really why Visual Studio is like the preeminent, Windows platform development tool. Nothing even comes close. All right. Once again, they're going to walk you through an exercise here where you're going to start to register the control. And you can see, it's a pretty easy little process. and then they explain it. So it's not that big of a deal. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is in order to enable some programmatic functionality and to be able to make sure that we identify the components of the user control uniquely, we use kind of what we call like a namespace type of container in order to uniquely identify an object. So when we talk about namespaces, and you guys, I'm hoping learned about this in advanced microprogramming, this group here. My regular web students don't get that class, so probably one of their only exposure to namespaces in this environment would be in this class. And basically what a namespace is like you take all your code and you encapsulate it inside a set of curly brackets, basically, and you give it a name like you do a class file. And now everything that's inside those curly brackets can be addressed by a prefix of the name dot whatever the other components are. And it's just a way to identify things and make them unique, because it's possible that you could create controls, right? Think about this very carefully, that you're going to add to a project where maybe you gave something the exact same ID because you're just using Visual Studio's automatic creation tools to generate your object. And it'll say user control 1, and maybe you didn't name it really well. And then how do you differentiate it? Are you going to go back and rebuild your user control? Why on earth would you do that? So what you do is you apply a namespace to it, and that's what this is about. So you can see a little example here of how they're basically saying vertical panel and client ID, so that there's an added namespace to the prefix to help you basically narrow down what you're working with. Now, they're pointing out here the client ID mode, and the whole point here is so that you can, once again, narrow down what you're working with and uniquely identify it. That's really what it kind of all boils down to. You guys know that when you apply an ID to an object on a web page, that object must be unique. But what if you're doing programmatic coding and the ID for the object, regardless of which state you choose in the conditional statement, so you have like an if-else, for example, how do you know which one's going to apply, and is it going to be unique or is it going to interfere? Do you see the confusion there? So that's why they have this client ID mode. It helps to narrow it down that way. And notice this little setting here. I'll give it a little highlight as well. Auto ID. So there has a component that if you're working programmatically, it allows you to dynamically allow the code to tailor the ID on its own to ensure that it's unique. Okay. All right. What's that? Within that project. Yes. Yeah. And that's a thing, folks. When you are building all these components that are designed to be reusable, you got to think about when you port them from project to project what the impact is going to be. That's why naming things clearly is really important. Don't just call it user control 1. Call it banner control. And even more specific than that if that helps you. All right. Now they're going to start talking about how you can make your controls do something aside from just sit there. I mean, actually, even controls that just sit there are cool because you have this reusable component, pull it into any project, right? So if you're working on a big, giant collection of websites for an organization and you already had the banner control built, you just pull it into any project and use it. Not a big deal. Now here, they're identifying a couple things that are interesting. And I'm assuming the people that have taken advanced micro have probably been exposed to a concept called enumeration. Can somebody tell me or share with the class what is an enumeration? And if you don't remember, what does it mean to enumerate something? It's a list. Just a list? I mean, in a nutshell, that is really what it is. But what's unique about that list? I mean, what makes it that enumerated list different than, let's say, an array?
The items in the list are labeled intuitively.
Okay, I like that description. So the items in the list are labeled intuitively. So you're using names that make sense. Okay. Does that sound to you at all like maybe like an associative array, like what you might have in PHP, or maybe using like JSON technology? Yeah, it's not too dissimilar. But enumeration, I mean, technically also is a numbering. So, I mean, you are creating a list, and you are creating something that is enumerated. I mean, basically, you're applying a numeric value to something that is named. So, what they're indicating here is that you can actually create your own custom enumeration. So, it's kind of, in a sense, creating your own data type. So, like when you're doing an associative array, you're doing key value pairs, and what those hold is really pretty subjective, because in essence, really, you're numbering something and you're telling it has this value, and then you just use that value to do things. So here they kind of say it's creating a data type. I don't know if I really necessarily agree with that. It's creating a data type, but it is creating a unique entity that is nameable and reusable.
So
Okay.
there's not a number behind that, or that coding where you're actually using that label as a number.
Yes, that's a good way to look at it. All right, so you can kind of see like the top little thing here where they're doing an enumeration, and then below they're taking those enumerated values and they're applying numeric equivalents to them. So a 0 and a 1, because the control itself needs to have the numeric value in order to trigger, to compile, basically, I think is what
But
happens.
the identifier is enumeration, not it's like, it's like a variable.
Yeah, in a sense, it's like a variable, right? But it's something you're creating uniquely to trigger a function here. In essence, what we're really kind of trying to do is coerce, the compiler to do what we want it to do, while yet using terminology in our code that makes sense to us, as opposed to saying 0 or 1. As simple as that. So once you've actually created the enumeration, what's kind of neat is that it then becomes a selectable property. So that's what this graphic is about. So, and the 0 and the 1 refer to the positions in the list. And then that allows it to appear as a property that we can manipulate directly within the properties window. And we created it. It wasn't pre-existing.
And you use any numbers,
Well, no, you can't use any numbers because the list is going to start at 0.
okay, so.
Right, because it's like an array, yes, it is an array. But we're enumerating it, we're giving it an identity, and therefore we're allowing Visual Studio to treat it as a unique property, really kind of a data type of sort an attribute that's attached to some sort of an entity. All right, so here they go through that process where you write the code to do exactly that. They actually have you doing a little bit of get and set there too, which is kind of nice. And then ultimately you're going to be writing some C# code that looks like this. And then it basically has a little switch case statement here that tells you that if you end up setting that property to horizontal, you hide the vertical and show the horizontal. It's pretty simplistic code, but it is an example of selecting a property from a window and then having it trigger a change in the code and therefore the visibility of an item. All right, fun little exercise. And then they go through and explain how that all works. And I believe this is probably one of the last little sections here where we talk about view state. Okay, as we work with server-side code, one of the added benefits of doing server-side stuff is the ability to use the state of an application and its interaction with the server and maintain that state for the benefit of the application. Now that can be it can be both a positive or a negative, but generally it's a positive in that you're working on a website a very primitive example, let's say you're filling out a form, then you hit the submit button and you didn't fill something out, and it asks you to fill it out, and then you go back to fix it, but everything's gone, right? It's not maintaining its view state, So this is kind of what we're referring to. All right, so what they're going to have you do here is they're going to have you basically run through this little exercise, and what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to maintain the post-back state so that if it sits in one condition, it remembers that, so that if you refresh the page or move somewhere else, it knows where it was at relative to the thing that you were doing. This one, I think, will be a little bit easier for you to see when you actually do the exercise. You will start writing code that will give you a default value if you're first hitting the page, and then it'll be different if you're moving from page to page, and you'll see when it executes.
So it's sort of like you're filling out a form, and in the same window, you go someplace else to see something to fill it, so you go back to it.
Yeah, I guess that's not a bad correlation, but this will set up like a default state, and the default state will be triggered by just simply loading the page. And then if you were to switch to a different page where that control is located, and then that page it sits in the other state, and then we come back to the other page, it will know which page it's going to and then adjust to that format. And I don't know if that helps to clarify it, because I'm not really sure. It sounded very clear to me as I was saying it. I think that a lot of this is like, as you do it, you'll understand it. Always read the how it works in the aftermath too. All right. I think we have maybe, a couple little things. All right. So this is one of the things that you might want to consider about working with a view state component, is that whenever you do set a view state for something, it maintains what value or state it's in, right? So whether it's vertical or horizontal in this case. But then every time you're doing stuff back and forth with the browser, every time there's a page request or re-rendering the page or whatever, that information moves back and forth each time. Now, having a setting of horizontal or vertical is a pretty small little setting. It's just a little tiny snippet of text. But it is possible with a view state engine to actually maintain real large sets of information that are active in memory. But the thing that's the problem with that is, let's say you're pulling in a couple of database tables and you're maintaining those active. The inefficiency of not only pulling that information all the way back from the server, but sending it back and forth, and how that can really slow down your application. So that sort of usage, manipulation of the view state engine needs to be very carefully done, because it can lead to applications that are very slow if you're not really clear on what you're doing. And they have a few tips here that you can read. Maybe I'll just pull a sentence or two out of here. It says, don't overuse them. You use them in a way that makes sense. A banner ad used in many spots on a website is a useful thing. Having it dynamically adjust from vertical to horizontal is kind of useful too. But you can see how that could quickly be overkill. So be careful in how you use it. Just keep in mind that everything that you do in a user control you can pick up and move. So the movability of it kind of necessitates the fact that you disassociate it from whatever data is built into that application. So you don't want to write a user control that requires a specific database, because what if that database is not part of that project, right? So that's the kind of thing you need to think about. And generally speaking, it's good to kind of make them real, purposeful. So in other words, you're not just building a user control because you don't want to, create that Facebook icon every time. You're doing it because it's really a useful thing for you. It's about the best way I can say it. All right, that wraps up Chapter 8. At this point, I'd like you guys to move into working on the code. You should have an ample amount of time before we take our next break to get most of it done. And then I'm here to help you if necessary.